He was just a quiet 16-year-old boy in a wheelchair, boarding a flight alone for the first time, heading to a tech summit he'd worked toward for months. But before the plane even took off, the flight attendant shoved his chair, ignored his service, and muttered something so cold it stayed with him the entire flight. She didn't ask his name. She didn't know he had built a device made for moments exactly like this. And with one quiet tap, he didn't just defend himself. He made the whole airline answer for it. Stay with this story, because what happened after they landed didn't just change his flight, it changed the rules for everyone. Stay with this video, because what this teen uncovers next will leave you stunned. And the truth? It was hidden in plain sight all along. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss one. Malik Trenor had never flown alone before. At just 16, he had already done things most adults only dreamed about. He'd built a working prototype of a speech-responsive drone and was invited to present it at a tech summit in Boston. He wore a clean gray hoodie, black jeans, and a soft brace on his left wrist that helped steady the spasms. His mother helped him into his wheelchair that morning with quiet pride, brushing down the shoulders of his jacket before letting him go. At the airport gate, he waited quietly, tapping through slides on his tablet. A few passengers smiled politely as they passed, but most didn't look twice. When the boarding call for passengers needing assistance was announced, Malik rolled forward alone, showing his ticket and ID. The woman at the counter waved him through without a word. The flight attendant assigned to assist him was named Paula Green. Her tight ponytail and sharp lipstick made her look strict, like someone who didn't care for small talk. She barely looked at Malik. Instead, she spoke to the agent behind him. "This the one?" she asked, already moving toward the jet bridge. When Malik said, "Hi, I'm Malik," she didn't respond, just grabbed the handles of his chair and pushed. It wasn't gentle. She moved fast, too fast. The right wheel scraped the side rail of the tunnel, jarring Malik's arm. He bit his lip. She didn't slow down. "Next time, pack lighter," she muttered under her breath. It wasn't loud, but a man behind them clearly heard it. He looked up, then looked away. Malik felt his face warm. He said nothing. When they reached row 5, Paula didn't ask if he needed help into the seat. She just stood, checking her watch, waiting. Malik shifted himself over slowly, carefully. She didn't offer his backpack, didn't check if he was buckled. She turned and walked off before he could say anything. That's when Malik knew this flight would be long. But what he didn't know yet was that it would also change something far bigger than he could see from seat 5A. The plane filled quickly. Passengers moved past Malik without much notice. Most were business travelers, judging by the leather bags and pressed collars. Some nodded politely as they passed, but no one stopped. Malik sat quietly, his backpack still tucked behind his feet. He looked out the window, his fingers resting on his tablet screen. He had planned to review his talking points, but his mind was somewhere else now. Across the aisle, a flight attendant handed headphones to a woman and offered snacks to a man in a blazer. Malik waited. Paula moved up and down the aisle, placing drinks on trays and handing out hot towels. She walked right past Malik's row, twice. No headphones, no towel, no drink. He pressed the small silver call button above him. It made a soft sound, and a yellow light blinked above his seat. Paula looked up, saw the light, and kept walking. Malik waited 5 minutes. Then another flight attendant, a younger man with short brown hair and tired eyes, approached from the back. "You rang?" he asked kindly. "Yes," Malik said, clearing his throat. "I didn't get headphones. And no one brought a towel or a drink." The man blinked, surprised. "I'll get that right away," he said, then turned back down the aisle. A few minutes later, Malik was finally handed a warm towel, headphones, and a plastic cup of apple juice. No ice, no straw. The juice was lukewarm. He glanced to his left. The man in the next row was sipping sparkling water, served in a glass. He had a cloth napkin on his lap and a snack tray neatly arranged in front of him. Malik took a breath, wiped his hands slowly with the towel, and placed it on the tray. He didn't complain. Not because he was afraid. He just knew better. Things like this weren't always loud. Most times they were quiet, hidden behind smiles and uniforms. He had seen it before. This wasn't about juice or towels. It was something else. Something that always made him feel like he was out of place, even when he had earned the right to be there. The plane had settled into its climb. The seatbelt sign was still on, but most passengers were now relaxed, scrolling through movies or checking their phones. Malik leaned his head back but didn't close his eyes. His hand stayed in his lap, fingers curled lightly. He could still feel the sting on his arm from earlier. Not sharp pain, just that dull soreness that reminded him of how carelessly he had been pushed. He watched Paula from the corner of his eye as she served row 3. Her posture changed depending on who she was talking to. When she smiled at the man in the aisle seat, it looked soft, practiced. She touched his shoulder gently as she handed him a menu. Her voice was light, friendly. When she glanced toward Malik's row again, her expression stiffened. She didn't smile. Malik turned back to the window. The clouds outside were scattered, bright in the sun. He thought about his mom. She had walked him all the way to security, double-checked his boarding pass, and hugged him like he was still 10. "You're not there to make friends," she'd said. "You're there to show them who you are." He had nodded, but now that voice in his head felt far away. The pilot made a soft announcement about cruising altitude. Malik didn't catch all of it. He was distracted by a familiar sound, Paula's voice coming closer. She stopped at row 5 with a tray in her hand. Her tone was light, but the look in her eyes was anything but kind. "You're Malik, right?" she asked, glancing at the name tag clipped to the armrest. He nodded once. "We're short on options this flight. Apple juice is what we have. If flying stresses you out, next time maybe plan ahead," she said, her voice just low enough not to be overheard by anyone more than one row away. She didn't wait for a reply. She set down another cup, barely 3/4 full, and walked away. Malik sat still. The cup wobbled slightly on the tray table. No straw, no apology. His throat felt tight, but he didn't speak. He looked across the aisle again. The woman 2 seats over now had a glass of white wine and a warm cloth over her legs. Paula was laughing with her, saying something about a Paris layover. Malik looked down at his tablet and slowly turned it face down on his lap. He wasn't in the mood to review slides anymore. Not right now. The man next to him, a middle-aged white man in business casual, cleared his throat softly. "She doesn't seem to treat everyone the same," he said under his breath, not looking directly at Malik. Malik didn't answer. He appreciated the effort, but words like that didn't change much. He reached for his backpack with one hand, slowly unzipped the side pocket, and pulled out a small device, a silver cube with a soft glow screen. It looked simple, but it was the front end of a secure system he'd built for monitoring accessible service environments. It had never been used outside testing. Until now. Malik held the cube in his palm, feeling the cool surface against his skin. The soft blue light glowed faintly from the screen as his thumb brushed over the edge. It was light, no bigger than a phone charger. It didn't look like much. That was the point. It was designed to blend in, to be used discreetly, by people like him, in moments like this. He had built it with a very specific kind of user in mind. Someone who didn't always feel safe speaking up in the moment. Someone who couldn't afford to be mistaken for aggressive just because they had a complaint. The system he designed wasn't about noise. It was about proof. He hesitated. This wasn't school. This wasn't a training session or a simulation. This was a real flight with real people and real consequences. He looked down at the small, almost invisible microphone embedded in the upper edge of the cube. It had already recorded Paula's voice from moments ago. "If flying stresses you out, maybe plan ahead next time." The words repeated in his mind, over and over. The way she said, "plan ahead," as if he'd done something wrong. As if sitting in that seat, with that wheelchair and that name tag, was already asking too much. He swallowed hard. A part of him wanted to let it go. Just ride out the rest of the flight, land in Boston, get to the hotel, present his project, and leave all this behind. That part of him was tired. Tired from years of being watched in stores, overlooked in science labs, and talked over at school award ceremonies. That voice said, "Let it pass. Don't start anything." But another voice, the one he heard when his mom sat with him late at night, telling him stories of his grandfather who had fixed radios in Mississippi with nothing but scrap metal, said, "No, you don't have to shout, but you do have to act." Malik looked up. Paula was near the front now, laughing again with another passenger. Her back was to him. She looked completely at ease, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't shoved his chair, skipped him during service, spoken to him like he didn't belong. His hand moved slowly, deliberately. He tapped the edge of the screen. A small interface opened, text only. No sounds, no flashing lights. He entered his FAA-linked code, one assigned to him through the Youth Innovation Program he'd been selected for earlier that year. Then he typed one sentence. Report. Possible discrimination event. Stratus Flight 2887, Seat 5A. He attached the audio file. The app uploaded it instantly, encrypted, and sent it to a designated inbox monitored by a team focused specifically on accessibility compliance. He had built that feature too, for emergencies. For moments when being polite didn't work, he stared at the screen for a few seconds after sending it. Nothing happened. No alert. No buzz. The app closed quietly and the cube screen faded back to blue, like it was never even touched. Malik exhaled slowly and placed the device back into the zippered pocket of his backpack. He didn't feel angry. Not exactly. He felt something colder, something more still, like water that had stopped moving but hadn't gone away. Out the window, the sky stretched wide and empty. The clouds had thinned now, distant patches of white over dark blue earth. He wondered what his mom would say if she'd been there. Probably nothing. Just a look. That look that said, "You did what you were supposed to do, quietly, without fear." The seatbelt sign turned off. Across the aisle, passengers unclipped and leaned back, already thinking about the next leg of their trip. Paula returned, collecting trash, her smile still in place. When she reached his row, she looked down at Malik with the same tired eyes, expecting nothing but silence. He looked back at her, didn't say a word, didn't need to, because the message had already been sent. The hum of the engines filled the quiet space around Malik, steady and low like a sound meant to make people forget they were 30,000 feet above the ground. Passengers flipped through magazines, stretched their legs, made small talk. But Malik sat motionless, his hands resting flat on his thighs, his back pressed against the seat. His face showed nothing, but his mind wouldn't stop moving. He stared down at the tray in front of him. The apple juice had gone warm. Condensation pooled around the base of the cup, untouched. He hadn't drunk any of it. He wasn't thirsty. Not anymore. What he wanted was something he couldn't name. Not an apology. Not even an explanation. He just wanted it to not feel normal. Because this kind of thing had started to feel normal. He hated that. He remembered sitting in classrooms where his ideas got ignored, until a white student repeated them louder. He remembered the science fair last year, when a judge assumed his robotics project had been built by his teacher. He remembered one time at a restaurant, when the waitress kept handing the check to his caregiver, even though Malik had ordered, paid, and spoken first. It was never direct, never loud, but it chipped away, quietly. Over time, he shifted his body slightly. His leg twitched, not from pain, but from the frustration rising in his chest. Paula walked past again, laughing softly with a man who wore an expensive watch and a clean navy jacket. She bent down when she spoke to him, placing a hand lightly on his arm as she cleared his glass. She moved with a rhythm, like she knew she belonged in that cabin, like she knew who mattered and who didn't. She hadn't looked at Malik once since her last remark, and no one else had asked him if he was okay. He scanned the row in front of him. A man typed on a laptop, a woman scribbled in a planner. Everyone was in their own world, Everyone had chosen not to notice. Or maybe they had noticed, but silence was easier. Silence made it someone else's problem. Malik turned and looked out the window again. A layer of clouds floated beneath them, calm and endless. For a second, he thought about what would happen if nothing came from the message he sent. What if it disappeared into some inbox and got buried? What if Paula went on like nothing happened? What if no one believed him? That fear, it sat heavy in his stomach. He didn't want to be seen as dramatic, or worse, as someone looking for trouble. He hated how people twisted things. He hated how quick they were to make you feel like speaking up was the real problem. But then he remembered what he had written in his application essay for the FAA program. Innovation doesn't always start with invention. Sometimes it starts with someone refusing to stay quiet. He had meant it when he wrote that. He had to mean it now. He reached into his backpack again, not for the cube this time, but for his notebook. The one with the sketch of his drone system on the first page and his mother's voice in the form of notes scribbled in the margins. He flipped to a blank page and began writing. Not tech plans, not code, just everything he had experienced on this flight. The moment at the gate, the push down the jet bridge, the skipped service, the look in Paula's eyes, the way his stomach dropped when she whispered, "Maybe plan ahead." He wrote it all, line by line. Not for revenge, not even to prove anything, just so he wouldn't forget. Because sometimes when things are small and quiet, people pretend they don't matter. Malik wasn't going to pretend. He kept writing. The page filled slowly, his handwriting tight but steady. And for the first time that day, he felt like he was back in control. Not of Paula, not of the airline, but of his own story. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He didn't need to. The truth had already been set in motion, and Malik Trenor had made sure it would be heard, whether they were ready or not. The plane rocked gently, dipping slightly as it crossed into a new airspace. The lights above dimmed to a soft amber glow. A calm voice came over the speaker, Captain Whitaker announcing they'd begun their descent into Boston and would land in about 40 minutes. Passengers stirred around Malik, waking from naps, finishing drinks, folding laptops. There was a shared sense of finality in the air. But Malik felt none of it. He had written nearly 2 full pages, and yet he didn't feel lighter. If anything, he felt heavier. Like each word had carried more than just the memory of the moment. It had carried years. And now those years were sitting quietly in his lap, inside a notebook that no one else would ever read. He rested the pen on top of the page and looked up. Paula passed his row again. She didn't stop, didn't ask if he needed anything. She smiled brightly at an older couple across the aisle. "Did you enjoy the flight today?" she asked them, her voice sugar-coated. The woman nodded and thanked her. Paula gave a light chuckle, brushing imaginary dust off her apron. Malik watched her the way a scientist watches a pattern, measured, careful. There was no anger in his eyes, just awareness, a clarity that had grown sharper with each quiet slight. It wasn't just that she skipped him. It was the way she changed around different people, the way she leaned in when serving the man with the briefcase, the way her voice softened when speaking to a young blonde woman in business class, and the way, with him, everything turned clinical, rushed, mechanical. He was a task, not a person. Malik leaned back in his seat and stared at the air vent above him. The hum of the engine was louder now, pressing against the silence in his ears. He wondered what the report team would see when they opened his message. He hoped they wouldn't just skim it. He hoped someone would actually listen to the recording, that they'd hear the tone behind Paula's words. The tone that made something as small as apple juice feel like a rejection. But still, there was a part of him that braced for nothing to happen. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He wasn't flying with lawyers or news cameras. He was just a kid with a prototype and a notebook. What if that wasn't enough? A brief wave of doubt passed over him. He thought about deleting the file, retracting the report. Maybe he was being too sensitive. Maybe Paula had just had a bad day. Maybe it really was just a mistake, and none of this meant anything. That voice, the one that wanted to smooth things over, to forget, pushed at him hard. But then he remembered how it felt when Paula said those words. If flying's too stressful, maybe plan ahead next time. That wasn't a bad day. That wasn't a system error. That was choice. And it was spoken with the ease of someone who had never been told she was wrong. He stared at the back of her head now, her ponytail swaying slightly as she leaned down to collect trash. That's when he noticed two men seated near the front of the cabin. Suits. Ties. One of them held a black folder on his lap. They weren't talking to anyone. Just observing. Watching. Malik's heart beat a little faster. He had seen this before. At a conference last fall, when a speaker faced an ethics complaint. Men like that, clean suits, quiet eyes, didn't show up unless something had already been triggered. He sat up straighter. Could it be because of his message? He didn't want to hope too soon. But the possibility stirred something inside him. Not excitement, not victory, just readiness. The truth, if it was coming, wouldn't be loud. And it wouldn't arrive with a spotlight. It would come the way injustice always showed up, quietly, efficiently, without warning. He looked back down at his notebook. His pen had rolled off the tray and landed between his leg and the seat cushion. He picked it up slowly, holding it between his fingers. It still had ink left, still had things to write. And Malik Trenor wasn't done yet. Not with this flight, not with the system, not with being treated like he didn't belong. Because this time the system was being watched too. The seatbelt sign chimed again. Passengers straightened in their seats. Some shifted their bags underfoot, others pulled out phones to check the time. The plane began to tilt slightly downward, angling toward descent. Boston's skyline would soon appear beneath them, though from Malik's window there was only a blur of gray clouds and distant light. He reached for the buckle and clicked it with a slow, practiced movement. The metal was cold against his fingers. He leaned back, his arms crossed lightly, resting just below his chest. He tried to focus on his breathing, counting quietly in his head, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the two men in suits up front. They hadn't moved. They weren't talking, just sitting, alert. It couldn't be a coincidence. He turned his head slightly, watching them through the gap between the seats ahead. One had a badge clipped discreetly to his blazer pocket. It caught the light for a second, enough for Malik to make out the word, operations. His pulse jumped, then steadied. Something was happening. But what? He looked toward Paula again. She was in the galley, checking her clipboard, pretending to read. Her mouth was tight, no longer smiling. She hadn't looked his way in a while, but Malik noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her posture had lost its polish. Maybe, just maybe, the message had reached someone. Someone with authority, someone who didn't need convincing. Malik blinked slowly, and then the fear came. Deep, familiar, not dramatic, but real. What if she found out it came from him? What if there was backlash? What if she confronted him before they landed? What if she twisted the story? He had no one with him, no adult, no witness, and he was still just a kid in a hoodie sitting in seat 5A. He didn't want to become the story. He only wanted the truth to be seen. His fingers gripped the side of his seat. He imagined the conversation playing out after the plane landed. Would someone call him into an office? Would he be questioned, doubted, or worse, ignored again? He remembered a time in 8th grade when he reported a teacher who called him exceptionally articulate in a way that didn't feel like a compliment. The counselor told him not to read too much into things. That memory came back now, uninvited but sharp. Number not this time. This time he had evidence, a recording, a log, a timestamp, a direct protocol routed through the accessibility compliance team tied to his FAA Youth Researcher ID. He hadn't just sent an email. He'd used a secure path, a tool built for exactly this. He had followed the rules. He had stayed calm. He had done it right. And still, his throat was tight. The plane gave a soft jolt as it dipped through a cloud layer. The city lights were now visible in the distance, scattered like gold dust across the earth. Malik looked out and thought about his hotel, the conference, the stage where he'd be presenting the drone prototype tomorrow, He had imagined that moment for months. The applause, the handshake, the spotlight. Now it felt different. He wasn't just arriving as a finalist. He was arriving as someone who had quietly called out what others ignored. Someone who didn't raise their voice but still made the system stop and turn its head. He looked down at his notebook. It was still open. A few passengers around him started whispering, glancing up toward the front. One of the suited men stood, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the galley. Malik watched him pass. The man said nothing, but when he reached the flight attendant area, Paula suddenly went very still. She didn't argue, didn't smile. She nodded once, tight and mechanical. The man said something too low for Malik to hear. Then he handed her a folded piece of paper. Paula's eyes scanned it. Her face didn't change, but her hands shook just slightly as she placed the clipboard down. She turned away and disappeared into the crew station. Malik's chest rose slowly with a deep breath. He didn't know what the paper said, but he knew enough. Something had shifted, and for the first time since boarding, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel out of place. He didn't feel like the invisible passenger in a seat no one remembered. He was Malik Trenor, seat 5A, and this flight wasn't over. The descent continued, slow and steady. The overhead lights dimmed once more, casting the cabin in a calm amber tone that made everything feel quieter than it was. Tray tables were locked, seats returned upright, but Malik barely noticed the announcement. His eyes stayed fixed on the front of the plane. Paula hadn't come back out. The man in the dark suit who had spoken to her returned to his seat silently, his expression unreadable. The other, still seated, adjusted something on his tablet. They weren't smiling. They weren't pretending to blend in. They looked like people who had come to see something for themselves, and had found it. Malik sat perfectly still. He should have felt relief. The message was received. Something had triggered the response. But his chest was tight, as if his body hadn't gotten the message that he was safe yet. His fingers moved nervously across the edge of his notebook, tapping in a slow, irregular rhythm. He kept replaying everything in his mind, like a tape he couldn't shut off. The jerk of the wheelchair, the way his arm hit the metal, that careless tone, plan ahead, the skipped service, the look on her face when she handed him that half-filled cup like it was a favor. All of it. And still, part of him asked, what if it wasn't enough? What if Paula lied? What if she said he had been rude? What if the report didn't matter because it wasn't loud enough to stick? That fear, that deeply American fear of not being believed, especially when you're black and young and alone, clung to him like a second skin. It didn't matter that he had done everything right. There was always a risk that doing things right wouldn't be enough. He looked out the window again. The clouds had thinned, and the ground was now visible. Rows of neighborhood lights stretching in geometric patterns, tiny moving cars like ants on distant highways. Boston. Almost there. His legs twitched slightly, a result of the tension he couldn't shake. The seat felt too tight now, too warm. He wanted to get off the plane. He wanted to breathe fresh air. He wanted to call his mom, not to tell her what happened, but just to hear her voice, to remind himself that he wasn't overreacting, that he had every right to feel what he felt. Then the pilot's voice returned, calm and even. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been given clearance to land. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We should be on the ground in approximately 10 minutes. The cabin responded with quiet motion. Books closed, window shades adjusted, conversations hushed. Malik didn't move. His eyes stayed forward. And that's when he noticed something else. Paula didn't come back for final checks. Instead, another flight attendant, an older woman with a short gray bob, walked down the aisle. She moved slowly, carefully checking each passenger's seatbelt. When she reached row 5, she gave Malik a small, gentle smile. She didn't speak, just nodded, confirmed he was secure, and moved on. It was a small moment, but it was different, polite, human, not forced, not dismissive, just decent. It made something twist inside him. Not joy, not victory, just release. A breath he didn't know he'd been holding for 2 hours began to ease out of him. This was what he had wanted. Not a grand apology, not a dramatic scene. Just to be seen, treated like he belonged here too. The plane dipped lower. Malik could now see the airport runway ahead. Lines of glowing lights stretched like welcome markers in the dark. He closed his notebook and tucked it back into his backpack. His hand hovered over the zipper for a second before he closed it fully. The cube stayed buried in the side pocket. The screen now dark, silent. He didn't need to look at it again. He had already spoken. Not with his voice, not with a complaint, but with a tap. A report. A quiet act that had pulled attention without noise. That was the difference. That was his kind of power. The wheels of the plane met the runway with a sudden, sharp screech, and for a moment the entire cabin tilted forward in unison. Bags shifted. A baby cried softly a few rows behind. And then, slowly, the plane began to slow. Malik looked forward. He didn't know exactly what was waiting for him outside that door. But he had a feeling, deep in his chest, that whatever it wasn't going to be silence anymore. And this time, he wouldn't be the one left invisible. The plane rolled across the tarmac, its brakes letting out a low groan as it eased into the gate. The familiar ding sounded, signaling that passengers could now unbuckle and prepare to disembark. Seatbelt clicks echoed through the cabin like dominoes, quick and mechanical. Overhead, bins opened. Coats rustled. Voices returned. But Malik Trenor didn't move. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, backpack zipped tight at his feet. His belt was still fastened, his posture still upright. While the rest of the cabin began to return to their routines, Malik waited. Eyes steady, shoulders tense. His heart beat slowly now, but each beat was sharp, like it was listening for something. A woman in the row across reached up for her carry-on. The man in front of him was already standing, smoothing the front of his shirt and tapping impatiently at his phone. The aisle was filling fast. But still, Malik waited. He hadn't been told to stay seated, no message, no announcement, but something in his gut told him this wasn't finished. Not yet. Then he saw them. The two men in suits had stood and moved toward the front exit, but they didn't leave. They stopped just outside the cabin door on the jet bridge. One of them pulled out a phone and began typing. The other, taller, darker coat, spoke quietly with someone outside of view. The door to the plane remained open, but no one was being let off yet. Passengers looked around. There was a small delay, but no explanation. The business traveler behind Malik shifted his weight, annoyed. "What's the holdup?" he muttered. The lead flight attendant, not Paula, stepped forward and spoke into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask for your patience for just a few moments as we complete a final procedural check. We'll begin deplaning shortly." The cabin quieted again. Curious glances, nervous glances. But Malik just stared ahead. His chest tightened. It was happening. Paula hadn't been seen since she was handed the paper. Was she still in the galley? Was she gone? The thoughts raced, fast but quiet, like footsteps in the back of his mind. Then, movement. A figure approached from the back of the plane. Paula, her face pale now, eyes tense. The ponytail that had seemed so sharp earlier now looked undone, stray strands falling near her temple. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She walked the length of the cabin with her hands at her sides, eyes forward. As she passed Malik's row, their eyes met for the first time since the beginning of the flight. It was only a second, a flicker, but he saw it. Recognition, uncertainty, and something that almost looked like fear. Not of him, but of what was waiting outside that door. She didn't slow her pace. When she reached the front, she didn't stop to assist passengers. She stepped past the other crew, past the suits, and exited onto the jet bridge. One of the men in black followed her immediately. The other stayed behind, standing just to the side of the door. "Passengers in rows 1 to 5 may now begin deplaning," the announcement came. Still, Malik waited. The man who had been watching the door now stepped slightly into the cabin and made eye contact with him. "Mr. Trenor?" Malik blinked, his lips parted slightly, unsure if he should speak, unsure what to say. "Yes," he answered, voice low. The man nodded. If you wouldn't mind staying just a moment longer, we'd like to speak with you briefly. Someone from our operations team will meet you at the door to assist. There's no issue with your flight. We just want to make sure everything is properly addressed. The words were carefully chosen, polite, controlled. But Malik understood. He nodded, silent. The other passengers filed past him slowly. Some looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to guess what was happening. One woman glanced at his wheelchair, then away quickly, pretending not to notice. The man from earlier, the one who had overheard Paula's tone, paused slightly as he passed. He didn't say anything, but he gave Malik a small nod. That was enough. When the last passenger cleared the aisle, Malik finally unbuckled his seatbelt. His legs were stiff. He took his time gathering his bag, placing the notebook carefully inside. He zipped the side pocket slowly, the edge of the cube just visible beneath the flap. Then he waited. Another staff member entered the cabin, a tall woman in a gray suit. She smiled gently. Mr. Trenor, my name is Dana Thorne. I'm with Stratus Accessibility Services. May I escort you? Her tone was calm, respectful. She didn't look over his head. She didn't talk to him like a child. She didn't touch his chair without asking. He nodded once. Yes. Thank you. She stepped back, allowing space. And with that, Malik turned his wheels forward, slow, steady, each movement deliberate. The same aisle that had felt narrow and silent on the way in now felt longer, more open. And waiting at the end of it wasn't more silence. It was the beginning of something else, something that couldn't be ignored. The wheels of Malik's chair rolled quietly across the carpeted jet bridge, each soft turn of the rubber tires echoing louder in his ears than the buzz of distant announcements or the gentle murmur of other deplaning passengers in the next gate. It felt strange, surreal even, like the air around him had thickened. The hallway was brightly lit, sterile, yet it didn't feel like just another airport passage. It felt like a threshold. At his side, Dana Thorne walked calmly, her heels clicking in even steps. She didn't say much, but her body language said enough. She stayed a respectful distance behind his shoulder, near but not looming. Her hands were clasped in front of her, not touching her phone, not checking her watch. She was present. That alone made Malik notice. At the end of the jet bridge, 2 more uniformed staff stood waiting beside a door marked, "Authorized personnel only." One of them, a man in his 50s with close-cut gray hair, had an ID badge clipped to his jacket. William R. Senior Airport Security Compliance. The other, younger, wore a navy blazer and held a clipboard close to his chest. Malik's stomach tightened. He wasn't afraid, but the tension in his chest returned. That same quiet pressure that came every time he was made to explain himself in rooms that didn't always believe him. Rooms with professionals. Forms. Walls that listened without speaking. Dana gently stepped ahead and spoke first. This is Malik Trenor, seat 5A, the passenger who submitted the incident report. The older man nodded and extended his hand. Mr. Trenor, I'm Bill Royston. You don't need to worry, we're not here to question you. We're here to thank you, you did the right thing. Malik hesitated, then shook the man's hand. His fingers were cold, firm grip, but not aggressive. He wasn't used to being addressed like this. Not at school, not at competitions, not even when he won things. We'd like to escort you to a private lounge, Dana said softly. Someplace quiet. No interviews, no press. We'll explain everything there. He nodded. The younger man with the clipboard pressed a badge to a security panel, and the door unlocked with a faint beep. Malik rolled through slowly. The hallway on the other side was quiet and sleek, the kind of space only airport staff usually saw. Frosted windows, polished floors, no crowd, no announcements. He was led down 2 turns and into a small room with modern chairs, a counter with bottled water and tea, and a screen mounted on the wall displaying flight data. It looked like a business lounge, but it wasn't. He knew that. Dana gestured to a chair near the wall and pulled one up beside him. Before we say anything further, I want to ask, how are you feeling right now? That caught him off guard. No one ever asked that first. He paused, looked down, then finally said, I'm all right. Not angry? She asked gently, but not in disbelief, like she wanted to understand. Malik shook his head. Not angry, he said quietly. Just tired. Dana nodded like she understood more than he'd said. I've read your report, I heard the audio, and I want to make something very clear. You're not the first person who's been treated that way, but you are the first who documented it like this, cleanly, calmly, and with enough precision that our internal systems couldn't ignore it. Bill stepped forward, holding a small tablet. Ms. Green, the flight attendant who pushed your chair and skipped your service, has been placed on immediate administrative leave. We've also flagged her file for prior behavior reports. There's a review already in motion, and the FAA has been notified. Malik looked down at his hands. His fingers curled lightly over the edge of his chair. She said it like it didn't matter, he murmured. Like I wasn't supposed to say anything. She didn't expect you to, Dana replied, her voice steady but low. Most don't. There was a long pause. Then Malik looked up, eyes clearer now. Will it change anything, or will they just shuffle her to another route? Bill didn't smile, but his expression softened. This time's different. There's footage, logs. The tech you used synced with our oversight database. You built something that exposed a pattern, not just an isolated incident. We've already had a preliminary meeting with our legal team. What you sent us triggered a red flag across multiple systems. Dana leaned in slightly. You didn't just send a complaint, Malik. You sent proof, and not for yourself. For others. You've given us a case that forces accountability. Malik felt the words settle over him slowly. Not heavy. Not dramatic. Just solid. Like bricks being placed in a foundation he hadn't realized he was building. And my name won't be used publicly, right? He asked. Dana nodded firmly. Not without your permission. Another long breath escaped Malik's lungs. His shoulders sank back against the chair. For the first time since boarding the plane, he felt something close to safety. Not just because of the room. Not just because Paula was no longer in uniform, but because the silence that had always followed people like him had finally been broken. And it wasn't by yelling. It was by being right, by being prepared, and by refusing to stay invisible in a space that depended on him staying quiet. Malik looked at the screen displaying the flight list. His eyes caught the next departing gate. Another Stratus flight, another city, and he thought, not for the first time, about the next person in seat 5A, and how maybe, just maybe, it would be different now. Because this time, someone had left a trail. The room grew quiet again after the last word settled. Malik sat motionless in his chair, staring not at the screen, but at the reflection of it on the glass behind Dana. The scrolling flight numbers looked like static in the distance, his mind no longer registering them. He wasn't thinking about Boston anymore, or the hotel waiting, or even the tech competition. He was thinking about what had almost happened, how easy it would have been to say nothing, how close he came to doing exactly that. All it would have taken was one shrug, one decision to stay quiet, and Paula would have continued on, laughing with the next set of passengers, leaning into conversations where she smiled for some and disappeared for others. Nothing would have changed. Nothing would have followed her. Malik clenched his fingers slowly, almost unconsciously, into the fabric of his pants. He thought back to the first time he ever questioned whether silence had a cost. He must have been 10. At a school science fair, he'd built a small sensor system using magnets to trigger a series of lights. His mother had stayed up late helping him solder the wires. It had worked perfectly. But when the judges came around, they walked past his table 3 times. They stopped at the boy next to him, Jack, from one of the private neighborhoods, whose volcano model erupted with red-dyed baking soda. One judge said, Now this one shows creativity. Malik had watched, expression flat, as they took pictures of the volcano. His sensor never triggered once, not because it failed, but because no one had tested it. He remembered packing up that day in silence. His mom had placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and whispered, "They don't see you yet, but one day they will." Now here he was, and they had seen him. But not because he shouted, not because he stood in the aisle demanding attention. They saw him because he left behind something they couldn't erase. Evidence. He looked up from his thoughts and met Dana's gaze. She was watching him, not with pity, not with performance, but with patience. She let the silence linger. She didn't fill it with corporate apologies or awkward smiles. She waited. And then she asked the one question he didn't expect. "Would you like to speak with someone from our oversight team directly? Not for formalities, for impact." Malik's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Dana leaned forward, folding her hands in front of her knees. "We're not just logging what happened. We're reviewing how it happened and how the system allowed it. That includes who ignored the earlier complaints about Paula, who flagged them but took no action. Your case isn't just about one flight. It's about the culture we've let exist quietly in the background." He hesitated. "And they'd actually listen?" She nodded. "With you? Yes, because your report isn't just personal. It's precise, and it's hard to argue with a teenager who coded the system that caught us failing." Malik's lips parted slightly. A quiet breath. He felt something stir deep in his chest. Not pride exactly, but purpose. Like a string being pulled tighter, not to snap, but to hold something up. He nodded slowly. "I'll talk to them." Dana stood. "We'll set it up, but no rush. Rest first." Bill walked forward and placed a sealed folder on the table next to him. "These are your formal case details. You'll have full access to all developments, and your privacy will remain protected unless you decide otherwise." Malik reached for the folder. His fingers brushed the smooth surface. Inside, he imagined, was the paper trail. His words turned official. A record that couldn't be smoothed over with polite statements or vague apologies. He opened it, just slightly, and saw his name printed neatly at the top. Passenger report. Trenor, Malik. Flight 2887. Seat 5A accessibility incident level. Escalated. And beneath it, a heading that read, "Action required. Internal culture review pending." He swallowed. It was real. All of it. He closed the folder gently, then turned back toward Dana. "I'm not trying to be a symbol," he said. His voice was quiet, but steady. "I just didn't want anyone else to think it's normal." Dana nodded. "You're not a symbol. You're a reminder of what happens when someone decides not to let silence be the last word." Malik looked away for a moment. His jaw tensed, not from anger, but from the weight of truth. And then, after a few seconds, he looked back. "I didn't build the system for people like her," he said softly. "I built it for people like me. People who get skipped, rolled too fast, called sir with a fake smile, while getting the worst service on the plane." Dana took a breath. "And now they'll have it too." He nodded, slowly. The quiet inside the lounge wrapped around him, not like a trap, but like a pause before something bigger. He didn't know what would come next, not exactly, but he knew it wouldn't be the same. Because silence this time had been interrupted by a voice that never even had to raise itself. Outside the lounge window, planes drifted across the runway like shadows, some preparing to rise, others coasting down into the glow of the terminal lights. It was late now. The airport had entered its quiet rhythm, that in-between hour where the energy shifted from rush to rest. But inside Malik, there was no calm. Even as the room around him softened into quiet tones and Dana stepped away to make arrangements, Malik's body stayed tense, his shoulders square, his jaw slightly set. Not from anger, but from restraint. He was still holding something in. He'd been taught to. From as far back as he could remember, the message was always the same. Be respectful. Be smart. Be careful. Don't give them a reason to see you as the problem. He had followed that code his whole life, even when kids at school made jokes about his wheelchair, even when teachers assumed his projects were assisted because of his disability, even when people praised him for being so well-spoken, like it was some kind of surprise. Now that discipline had done something rare. It had worked, but the weight of it still pressed on him. He reached for the folder again, this time slowly opening it fully. The document inside was clear, professional. There were line items, references to timestamps, transcripts of the audio recording from the flight, already documented and labeled, attendant tone, passenger interaction, evidence submitted via FAA Youth Developer Access Code. One section was labeled, Prior Incident History, Paula Green. Malik paused, eyes narrowing slightly. There were 3 other passenger complaints in her file. One 2 months ago, where a passenger in a support harness was reportedly skipped during food service. Another from last year, an elderly man traveling alone who was rushed during deplaning. A third from an unaccompanied minor whose guardian reported cold or neglectful service. All marked, insufficient grounds for disciplinary action. Malik clenched his fist slowly around the edge of the paper. There it was, laid out in neutral language, but not neutral at all. These weren't accidents. This wasn't someone just having a bad day. This was a pattern. And worse, a system that saw the pattern and let it pass. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a long moment. He could still hear Paula's voice in his mind, the way she said, "If flying's too stressful." She hadn't yelled, she hadn't cursed. But that made it worse. Because it was so casual, so practiced, so invisible to anyone who wasn't used to listening for that kind of cruelty. And how many people had heard that tone before him, just taken the sandwich, stayed quiet, gone home and tried to forget it. He opened his eyes again. The room felt smaller now, even though it hadn't changed. He was just more aware that there were names behind every line of that report. Real people, real humiliation. None of them had pushed hard enough for the system to act. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were tired. He was tired too. But tired wasn't the same as done. The door clicked open behind him, and Dana returned. She was holding a tablet and a small card. She looked calm, but Malik saw something different in her eyes this time, something firmer. "They've reviewed everything," she said, sitting again across from him. "The review panel is being escalated to the executive level. They're meeting at 7 a.m. Paula won't be on any flights until a decision is made." Malik didn't nod. He simply took that in. He didn't need reassurance. He needed follow-through. Dana slid the card across the table. "This is your access credential to view the case updates directly. No filters. You'll see everything they do." He picked it up, running his thumb along the edge. "Also," she continued, "the Vice President of Accessibility Training has asked to speak with you directly, if you're willing. Not tonight, but tomorrow. You're under no obligation." But she said something that stuck with me. Malik raised an eyebrow, waiting. She said, "I want to speak with the kid who didn't wait for the system to notice him. He made the system notice itself." That hit different, not because it was praise, but because it wasn't flowery. It was truth. Someone had finally understood that Malik hadn't acted for credit. He'd acted because he was done being treated like a seat number instead of a person. He exhaled, long and deep. Then, for the first time since the wheels of his chair touched the jet bridge, Malik let his guard fall slightly. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but not weaker. "I don't want her fired," he said. "I want them to change the way they train people like her. Because if she goes, and nothing changes, they'll just hire someone else who does the same thing." Dana nodded slowly. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. "Put me in the room with the people who build the rules," he added. "Let me talk to them." His words surprised even him, but they came from somewhere solid, somewhere earned. And Dana, without blinking, said, Okay, we will. Outside, another plane lifted off into the night, lights blinking against the sky. Inside, Malik stared down at his access card, then back at the folder, then at the screen. And he knew. He wasn't just leaving a complaint. He was leaving a footprint. And for the first time, the floor beneath the system had started to shift. It was past 11 p.m. when Malik finally left the private lounge. The airport had changed in the hours since his flight landed. The noise was thinner now. Fewer footsteps, the voices quieter. Most of the gates sat empty, their signs glowing with delayed red eyes or early morning departures. In that near silence, the hollow echo of a rolling suitcase or the soft scuff of a janitor's mop filled the space like background music no one asked for. Malik rolled himself slowly down the corridor, Dana walking a respectful pace behind him. The folder was tucked into his backpack now. The access badge slipped into the small front pouch, right beside his prototype cube. He could feel the weight of both of them. One he had built from metal, wires, and code. The other had built itself tonight, from silence, from small humiliations, from a voice that chose precision over volume. His body felt heavy. His spine ached from sitting so long. But there was a stillness in him now that hadn't been there on the flight, a settled sort of clarity, like something inside had shifted back into place. They stopped outside a private exit near the conference center pickup area. A black shuttle waited at the curb, engine running, tail lights blinking gently in the cold. It would take him to the hotel where his room had already been arranged. A quiet place, Dana had said. Not far from the venue. As she turned to him, Dana didn't offer a handshake this time. She simply looked at him, not as an employee, not as someone managing damage, but as a person. You know, she said gently, when I was your age, I took my first flight alone too. But I didn't say a word when something went wrong. I just told myself to forget it. Malik tilted his head. Did you forget it? Dana smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Number I just stopped flying that airline. He didn't smile either. He just nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. After a pause, she added, most of us get tired before we get loud. But you didn't just speak. You made your silence count. She opened the car door and stepped back. Malik wheeled himself up to the edge, then turned briefly before lifting the brake on his chair. You're right, he said, but I'm not done yet. Dana raised an eyebrow. Oh? Malik looked at the night sky. Planes still moved overhead, barely visible between clouds. I'm not just going to speak to the training execs, he said. I'm going to build a version of the app just for passengers. No codes, no tech teams, just one button. Press it and it logs the service. Voice, delay time, notes. Dana was quiet, listening. Malik's tone stayed even. People won't always say what happened, but machines don't forget. Real-time accountability, she murmured. Not just that, he said. Proof. Before someone else ends up in seat 5A wondering if they imagined it. He reached into his lap and tapped the cube once. The faint light came back on. Dana finally smiled, for real this time. You're not waiting for systems to change, you're designing the one that should have existed in the first place. Malik shrugged, quiet. That's what builders do. The ramp lowered from the shuttle, and he wheeled himself up onto it, letting the door close behind him without another word. Through the tinted glass, Dana watched as the interior light hit his face just for a second. Exhausted, but composed. Young, but not naive. The shuttle pulled away into the night. Inside, Malik didn't check his phone. He didn't scroll or post or text. He just sat there, backpack by his side, hand resting lightly on the cube. He thought about tomorrow. Not just the competition, though that still mattered. He thought about the woman in seat 18C on another flight next week, the one who might be skipped during drink service. He thought about the teenage boy who would hesitate to press the call button twice because the flight attendant rolled her eyes the first time. He thought about the invisible line people like him crossed every time they asked for equal, instead of just enough. And he thought, This isn't the end of a story, it's just the first thing they'll remember me for. The shuttle merged onto a dark highway, headlights stretching into the horizon. Malik leaned his head against the window, eyes open, the lights of the airport slowly shrinking behind him. But what he left behind wouldn't shrink. Not this time. Not ever again. The hotel room was quiet when Malik entered. Too quiet, maybe. The kind of stillness that made the sound of the door closing behind him echo just a little too long. Carpeted floors, cream-colored walls. A soft gold lamp lit the corner. A neatly folded robe draped across the bed, untouched. He wheeled himself toward the window first. Outside, the city was sleeping. The roads were nearly empty. The skyline shimmered in silence. Tall office towers blinked faint red lights from their rooftops like a heartbeat too slow to notice during the day. Malik leaned his head slightly against the glass. The surface was cold. It grounded him. He didn't rush to unpack. He didn't check the TV. He didn't plug in his phone. He just sat there, still in the dark, staring out. Because now, after everything that had happened, after the humiliation, the report, the meeting, the confirmation, it was hitting him in a way it hadn't during the flight or the lounge, or even the quiet ride through Boston streets. He had changed something, but it came at a cost. Not a public one, not a loud one, an internal cost. Because now he had to hold it, carry it. He had watched a woman look through him for 2 hours in the air, watched her treat strangers with gentleness and serve him with calculated indifference, and even when justice showed up in the form of policy and oversight, it didn't erase the small humiliations, the missed napkin, the tight wrist, the whisper about planning ahead. No headline could take that away. He thought about calling his mom. He should have. But for some reason, he hesitated. He didn't want her to hear the weariness in his voice. He knew she'd hear it in a second. He'd rather call her in the morning, after the summit, after he stood on stage with his drone prototype and spoke about innovation and ethics in assistive tech, after he smiled for the judges and answered their questions and let the world see him for something other than the passenger who had been skipped. But in this moment, he was still just Malik, a 16-year-old kid alone in a hotel room, holding on to a win that didn't quite feel like victory yet. He reached for his backpack and took out the folder again. There was a line in the middle of the report that had stuck with him since the moment he saw it. Unverified prior incidents involving disabled or minority passengers were noted, but no disciplinary action was taken. That word, unverified. What made something verified? Volume, public attention, rage, and how many truths had been buried under that label? He placed the folder on the desk and reached into the smaller front pocket for the cube. It glowed faintly in his hand, the blue light pulsing gently like a breath. Malik placed it next to his laptop, opened the screen, and logged into his private developer dashboard. The page loaded slowly. The air in the room felt stiller than before, like even the silence was waiting to see what he'd do next. Lines of code stared back at him, familiar, comforting. He scrolled past the voice recognition modules and landed on the feature he'd never activated publicly, the one designed for anonymous use. It had been an idea once, a what if, a maybe later, not anymore. He clicked into it, and a dialog box appeared. Enable one-tap reporting mode. This feature allows real-time audio and timestamp logging with optional location tagging. No login required. Records are sent to a secure, encrypted database monitored by licensed advocacy partners. He hovered over the option for a moment, then clicked yes. It didn't make a sound, didn't flash, just a quiet system acknowledgement. Enabled. Malik leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. He knew it wouldn't fix everything, not yet, maybe not ever. But it would give someone else a tool he didn't have when he first boarded that plane. Not to fight, not to shout, just to record, to be believed, to be counted. He sat there a while longer, the cube's soft light the only thing glowing in the room. And for the first time since that moment on the jet bridge, when he felt her shove his chair forward like luggage, Malik allowed himself to feel it all. The ache, the weight, the quiet power. Because he hadn't yelled. He hadn't begged. He had built something, and through that he'd made the system hear him. Now, maybe, just maybe, it would start listening to others too. Morning light filtered through the window, soft and golden. It spilled across the carpet, stretched over the edge of the desk, and landed on Malik Trenor's lap as he sat quietly in the hotel chair. Awake, dressed, and still. He hadn't slept much, maybe 2 hours at most. But his mind wasn't racing anymore. It had calmed. Not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time in a long time, the weight wasn't only his to carry. Outside, Boston was coming alive. Car horns in the distance, the hiss of buses, a woman laughing below his window as she crossed the street, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. Just another morning for everyone else. But for Malik, it marked something different. Today he would take the stage at the Youth Tech Summit. He would stand behind a sleek podium, surrounded by peers and judges and sponsors, and he would present the assistive drone system that he'd spent a year building. He'd demo its response time, its safety sensors, its accessibility features. People would nod, some might applaud, some would take notes, shake his hand, ask questions. But none of them would know that the real system he launched had gone live 12 hours earlier. No fanfare, no media, just a button that could quietly change everything. He reached over and picked up the cube again, holding it loosely in one hand. The light blinked, steady. Its signal had already confirmed 23 interactions logged overnight from around the country. Mostly flight attendants, a few hotel desk agents. One entry from a wheelchair-accessible Uber pickup that had marked, "No ramp provided." 23 truths that might have gone unseen. Now saved. Malik let that number settle in. It wasn't validation. It wasn't applause. It was something better. It was evidence. And for someone who had spent years being made to feel like he imagined things, that was everything. His phone buzzed on the desk, a text from his mother. "Proud of you, always. Don't let them talk over your light today." He smiled softly. Her voice in text was just as strong as it was in person. He typed a simple reply. "I won't. Love you." He stood now, slowly, moved to the mirror by the window, checked the collar of his dark blue shirt, adjusted the straps of his chair, looked at himself, not like a kid anymore, not just a student or a programmer, but as someone who had made something real, not for likes, not for praise, for people like him, for the ones too tired to explain themselves again, for the ones who were skipped, dismissed, and still stayed composed. He thought about Paula, and strangely, not with anger, he thought about the shrug in her voice, the way she never imagined she'd be recorded. She'd been part of a system that protected that kind of silence. Now she was part of the moment that ended it. He didn't know what would happen to her long term, whether she'd change, whether the company would follow through with its training promises. But he knew this. She would remember the boy in 5A, the one who didn't shout, the one who didn't argue, the one who said nothing, and made everything move. Malik rolled toward the door, slid the access badge into his backpack, and paused just before turning the handle. He glanced back at the room, at the cube glowing on the table, at the folder still open, report pages spread like the start of something much bigger than him. Then he whispered, not for anyone to hear but for himself, "Let this mean something for the next kid." And then he left. In a quiet terminal across the country, a woman in a wheelchair waited for assistance that never came. She pressed a small silver button on an app she had just downloaded that morning. A log began. No sound, no attention, just truth. Saved. On her screen, a message appeared. "Thank you. Your report has been received." And beneath that, in small, simple letters, "Built by M. Trenor. Verified by you." Because some stories don't need to be loud to matter. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to disappear. This wasn't just a story about a boy in a wheelchair. It was about quiet courage, real accountability, and the power of building change instead of begging for it. If this story moved you, please give it a like, Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true, powerful stories just like this one.